There comes a moment in every narcissist's life when their strategy stops succeeding. The charisma weakens. Others begin to recognize the deception, and the influence they once thrived on starts to fall apart. Psychologists explain that this downfall is unavoidable because manipulation cannot sustain itself forever. When everything unravels, the narcissist is left in chaos, and what they resort to can be startling. At first, denial takes control. Narcissists refuse to admit that their stream of attention has disappeared. They persuade themselves that nothing is different. Psychologists refer to this as cognitive dissonance. They act as though life is flawless, share cheerful images online, or boast about achievements while everything quietly collapses behind the scenes. Denial becomes their defense against reality. Then anger rises. Psychologists point out that when their facade begins to crack, narcissists strike out at those who once supported them. They accuse, slander, or criticize, frantically trying to reclaim dominance. Yet this fury works against them, pushing even more people away. Instead of regaining authority, they create fear and distance. In the end, they destroy the very connections they once relied on. Some attempt hoovering, reconnecting with former targets. Psychologists explain that when admiration dries up, narcissists reach back into the past. They send affectionate texts, staged apologies, or sudden emotional confessions. But these efforts are not rooted in love. They are driven by necessity. What they truly mean is, I need your attention again. When they are ignored, their breakdown intensifies. Others distract themselves through impulsive behavior. Psychologists observe that without praise, many narcissists chase immediate highs, spending excessively, abusing alcohol, or entering superficial relationships. These escapes provide short-lived comfort but generate further disorder. Rather than rebuilding their lives, they sink deeper. Their refusal to confront the truth traps them in ongoing patterns of self-sabotage. When isolation begins, panic follows. Psychologists emphasize that narcissists dread loneliness more than anything. Their identity depends on being noticed. When engagement stops, they face an emptiness they cannot endure. To escape it, they may spread rumors, create drama, or ignite conflict. Anything that restores a sense of relevance, even if harmful, some adopt the role of the perpetual victim. Psychologists describe how they reverse the narrative, insisting they were mistreated or misunderstood. By portraying themselves as sufferers, they attempt to reclaim sympathy. Yet this tactic also fails over time as behaviors repeat. People eventually tire of the constant blame and excuses, and attention fades again, leaving them exposed. As the collapse deepens, regret appears, though not in a healthy form. Psychologists explain that narcissists mourn the loss of control, not the loss of individuals. They do not miss who you are, they miss how you reinforce their power. This distorted regret pushes them to seek replacements, but none truly satisfy the emptiness that remains. Many begin altering the past. Psychologists note that they may deceive even themselves, claiming, I never cared, or they were at fault. This distortion shields their fragile ego, but blocks any possibility of growth. By avoiding honesty, they imprison themselves within illusion, unable to evolve. Ultimately, they live inside the stories they create. Planned. When everything finally collapses, the narcissist confronts what they have always feared, their own reflection. Psychologists remind us that without external validation, they are left with shame, insecurity, and inner emptiness. The mask has fallen, and there is no escape. Some fall apart, others react with hostility, but all must face the truth they have long avoided. Blenda. When they realize no one is paying attention anymore, desperation intensifies. Psychologists explain they may invent dramatic emergencies, sudden health scares, emotional crises, or financial problems to draw others back in. These scenarios are crafted to trigger sympathy, but as the pattern repeats, even devoted supporters begin to see the manipulation. Narcissists may also hunt for new admiration in unexpected places. Psychologists observe that they attempt to charm coworkers, distant family members, or strangers online. The desperation becomes clear because the charm feels unnatural and the strategies obvious. In the process, they drain everyone around them, revealing that without steady admiration, they unravel. Some withdraw into fantasy. Psychologists explain that when reality becomes too painful to accept, narcissists construct elaborate fantasies about their achievements, relationships, or significance. These imagined narratives briefly comfort their ego, yet they deepen their isolation. Over time, others stop trusting what they say, leaving them confined within a world they created where deception feels mend as their influence fades. Narcissists often intensify control in minor areas. Psychologists note they may criticize constantly, dominate discussions, or fixate on insignificant routines. These tiny triumphs offer a short-lived sense of command, but they actually reveal how powerless they feel. Once commanding chaos, they reduce themselves to controlling details. Some retaliate with smear campaigns. Psychologists emphasize that when authority slips, they target the reputations of those who walked away. They circulate gossip, distort events, and portray themselves as wronged. Yet these tactics frequently backfire. As inconsistencies become clear, their credibility erodes, and what was intended to harm others damages their own image instead. Isolation becomes their most severe consequence. Psychologists remind us that narcissists depend on an audience to function. When their social circle diminishes, they are left alone with feelings they long avoided: shame, anxiety, emptiness. For many, this quiet is intolerable. They may surround themselves with distractions, but the void persists, echoing the connections they lost. And at times, they plunge into impulsive relationships. Psychologists observe that in search of validation, narcissists rush into new romances with intense speed. They accelerate intimacy to secure admiration. However, these connections unravel quickly as familiar behaviors return. Each collapse reinforces a truth they resist. The issue was never everyone else, but themselves. Some attempt reinvention. Psychologists highlight that they may announce dramatic change, a spiritual breakthrough, therapy, or sudden humility. Yet often this transformation is another act designed to regain attention. Without genuine accountability, improvement remains superficial. Ultimately, they recycle the same dynamics under a different appearance. As their efforts fail, their manipulation grows more obvious. Psychologists explain that once patterns are recognized, the narcissist's influence weakens. Where they once drew compassion, they now provoke fatigue. They repeat the same phrases, unaware that their audience no longer believes them, leaving them exposed and ineffective. Bitterness can take root. Psychologists describe how narcissists fixate on perceived betrayals, convinced others conspired against them. This resentment seeps into every interaction, pushing people further away. In the process, they isolate themselves with hostility, nourishing anger instead of pursuing healing. Their unwillingness to release blame keeps the cycle alive. Toward the end, envy intensifies. Psychologists note that narcissists may obsessively compare themselves to those who left. Watching others thrive highlights their own dissatisfaction. They observe from a distance, resentful of the happiness they forfeited, yet unable to admit their role in losing it. Slant. Some develop compulsive patterns to numb the emptiness. Psychologists explain they might immerse themselves in excessive work, addictions, or nonstop activity. Each fixation acts as a temporary patch rather than a solution. Instead of confronting their inner void, they drown it in noise. When the distraction fades, the loneliness feels even heavier. Others cling tightly. Psychologists observe that they frequently recount past accomplishments, relationships, or successes to anyone willing to listen. This nostalgia reveals more than they realize. The present feels hollow. They retreat into memories because imagining the future feels uncertain and threatening. In deeper collapse, depression can emerge. Psychologists emphasize that when the mask finally fails, the inner emptiness becomes overwhelming. Without external validation, they feel insignificant because their identity depended entirely on approval. They withdraw, weighed down by despair, yet still resist genuine self-examination, the very step that could lead to change. Even during breakdown, many avoid sustained therapy. Psychologists explain that admitting responsibility threatens their fragile self-image. They may briefly engage in counseling, but often leave when challenged, choosing comfort over confrontation with the truth. What they ultimately do is undermine their own recovery, choosing the illusion of power instead of the vulnerability required for real growth. Sadly, this guarantees the pattern continues, confining them within a prison of their own making. Some narcissists attempt to reconstruct their public persona. Psychologists point out how they abruptly present themselves as charitable, caring, or modest in social settings. Yet privately, very little shifts. These displays might convince outsiders, but not those who understand their history. In the end, they live a split existence, draining themselves to preserve a polished image. Others pursue symbols of status. Psychologists observe that when genuine affection and respect vanish, narcissists substitute them with wealth, possessions, or prestigious roles. They showcase vehicles, properties, or professional titles as evidence of worth. However, these markers cannot mend the emptiness within. What they end up doing is chasing illusions, confusing appearance with identity, and still feeling hollow when the spotlight fades. As relationships dwindle, some tighten control over the few who remain. Psychologists explain they demand unwavering loyalty, clinging to the last threads of influence. This creates unhealthy dependence, suffocating those still present, until eventually even the most faithful step back. In doing so, they dismantle the remnants of their support system. The unraveling of a narcissist is gradual yet unavoidable. Psychologists emphasize that their familiar tools, anger, denial, manipulation, lose impact over time. They recycle outdated tactics in desperation, unaware that their audience has evolved. Eventually, the performance ends, revealing not the crafted persona, but the exposed emptiness long concealed. Bull-ons. When everything collapses, narcissists confront a frightening reality. They are alone with themselves. Psychologists explain this is their deepest dread, because without external validation, the facade disintegrates. They resort to noise, conflict, falsehoods, or distractions to escape the quiet, yet none provide relief. Ultimately, they cannot outrun the truth they avoided for years. At this stage, some frantically search for replacements. Yet each new source of attention feels weaker than before. Psychologists note that nothing replicates the intensity of past control. They move through friendships, romances, or communities, but connections rarely endure. What they end up doing is pursuing one empty bond after another, highlighting the void they cannot satisfy. Bland others channel their anger towards society. Psychologists observe that when personal dominance fades, they fault the world at large. They complain about injustice, betrayal, or shifting values. This outward hostility conceals inner collapse. In the process, they distance even more people, showing that their downfall stems as much from resentment as deception. But narcissists frequently replay former conflicts in obsessive loops. Psychologists explain they revisit arguments, imagining how they should have prevailed. This repetition is not healing but rumination. They remain in a mental courtroom where they are perpetually wronged, expending energy on narratives that no longer concern anyone else. Meander as the decline deepens. Paranoia may surface. Psychologists highlight that they begin believing others are discussing them, conspiring against them, or rejoicing in their failure. This suspicion reflects a fragile ego, unwilling to accept accountability. Consequently, they alienate even allies, convince trust is impossible, and surround themselves with imagined threats. In rare instances, a few attempt sincere self-examination. Psychologists stress that only a minority confront their behaviors honestly. When they do, the realization is painful, forcing them to face years of harm. They struggle with guilt, embarrassment, and fear. For some, this confrontation can inspire growth, but for many, the burden feels overwhelming. Financial instability is another common outcome. Psychologists explain that maintaining an impressive image often leads narcissists to overspend. When collapse arrives, debts surface and admiration disappears. They scramble to regain footing, sometimes exploiting others for resources. Yet without credibility, opportunities close, leaving them vulnerable both emotionally and materially. Some withdraw entirely. Psychologists note that without attention, they retreat from social contact, avoiding events, friends, and even relatives. They hope invisibility protects them from humiliation. Yet in solitude, they meet what they fear most: their own unfiltered reflection, unseen and uncelebrated. Even their physical well-being may begin to deteriorate. Psychologists emphasize the link between prolonged stress, chronic anger, and physical illness. When everything falls apart, many narcissists begin facing health problems they can no longer dismiss. What they end up doing is blaming other people or unfortunate circumstances, refusing to recognize how their own behavior contributed to their decline. Denial becomes the final wall separating them from truth. Narcissists also lose credibility in lasting ways. Psychologists explain that once their patterns are exposed, their reputation rarely fully recovers. Even when they try to start over, rumors and memories of the past trail behind them. What they end up doing is attempting to escape their history, yet it follows relentlessly. Without trust, each new beginning eventually crumbles, trapping them in repeated cycles of reinvention and disappointment. Their relationships deteriorate one after another. Psychologists note that relatives, friends, and partners ultimately grow weary of constant chaos. What they end up doing is driving away the very people who once supported them, often reaching later years surrounded by acquaintances rather than genuine bonds. The emptiness they feared becomes a reality shaped by their own decisions. Some cling to self-delusion until the end. Psychologists explain that they continue crafting stories of superiority, persuading themselves they never truly lost. Yet beneath the act, awareness lingers. What they end up doing is hiding inside fantasy to shield themselves from despair. But this protection also others persist in manipulation even as they decline. Psychologists highlight that instead of changing, they sharpen their tactics, focusing on individuals less likely to recognize the signs. What they end up doing is exploiting the inexperienced. However, each scheme collapses more quickly than the last, leaving them with diminishing options until even vulnerable targets withdraw. Toward the end, many carry silent regret. Psychologists emphasize that this regret often remains unspoken. They think about partners, children, and friends they forced away, aware those relationships are unlikely to return. What they end up doing is replaying lost possibilities, haunted by damage that cannot be undone or replaced. Some attempt to conceal regret with heightened arrogance. Psychologists explain that they boast more intensely, inflating accomplishments to cover insecurity. Yet the louder the display, the emptier the truth beneath it. What they end up doing is performing for themselves, hoping exaggeration will dull the pain. Still, each boast quietly reminds them of what slipped away, because reality persists beneath illusion. Eventually, exhaustion sets in. Psychologists note that years of conflict, manipulation, and denial drain their strength. What they end up doing is slowing down, no longer capable of sustaining the facade. Energy fades and the mask fractures permanently. For many, this marks a subdued collapse, less dramatic, yet deeply painful as they realize the act can no longer continue. Narcissists may also feel intense envy toward those who healed. Psychologists explain that witnessing former victims flourish is difficult to bear. What they end up doing is observing from a distance, silently comparing, aware they may never experience that same peace. Their envy becomes its own consequence because the freedom others gained is something they struggle to attain. Sometimes they make final attempts to regain importance. Psychologists describe how they might provoke arguments, share exaggerated crises, or plead for another opportunity. By this stage, however, their reputation often precedes them. What they end up doing is humiliating themselves as people recognize the familiar cycle and decline to participate, leaving the narcissist in rare moments of clarity. They may acknowledge that their downfall resulted from their own actions. Psychologists highlight that this awareness can feel both liberating and crushing. What they end up doing is either seeking genuine help or sinking further into hopelessness. Only a small number choose growth, but for them, it represents the first authentic step toward change. Most, however, remain entrenched. Psychologists explain that narcissists struggle to relinquish control or abandon familiar behaviors. What they end up doing is repeating the same patterns until the end, chasing validation that never truly satisfies. Their story concludes not with serenity, but with a hollow echo of authority they once pretended to possess. blend. So when everything collapses for a narcissist, what do they truly end up doing? They deny, erupt in anger, manipulate, unravel, and regret, but seldom transform. Psychologists remind us that this conclusion is not about revenge, it is about consequence. And the real triumph belongs to those who chose to break free, ensuring that this ending does not become their own.